start the event. So welcome everyone to Shared Path Consultation Initiative's first event of 2022, a panel discussion on anti-Indigenous racism and planning. My name is Morgan Peters. I'm the Executive Director of Shared Path Consultation Initiative. I'm going to ask Carolyn King to give an invocation. She has been having a few tech difficulties, but why don't we give it a go, Carolyn? You want to unmute yourself?
Okay. My name, Carolyn King, Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and I want to thank all those who are joining us today for this event discussion and kind of what Shared Path is all about, looking at the sort of issues, sometimes frustrating issues that come up in the land use planning between the First Nations and the municipalities. So, and whether there's a systemic problem, I can't say that I know that, but we know historically there's been issues and conflict that has occurred in our province here. And I can especially talk about where I am from Mississaugas of the Credit, adjacent to the Six Nations. And we don't need to look far to know that Caledonia is still an issue and that haven't seemed to resolve that matter over all this time. It's been over a decade that there was real protests and blockages and frustration, and that I think as we continue to talk or talk about the issues and the way things are done, whether there's a better path to take, and I think that the work that Shared Path endeavors is to try bring out those issues and see what can be done for them. And I'll say most of the time it involves dialogue. And so I appreciate everyone coming on, and from the wherever people are coming. Like I said, this is I'm one of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation members, and I was the former chief, and I did do the I was participated in the land claim settlement for Toronto, as well as the earlier one, Mississauga 200-acre claim. So I've been involved in those matters for many, many years, and that it takes that a lot of time and a lot of effort and work to settle some of these long-standing issues. And so I've become involved in a lot of the land use planning, the policies, and that for us as the treaty people, and as well as in our traditional territory, this I welcome you for participating and hope that those in different treaty areas can relate. Please let us know if there's things that Shared Path might be able to do for you. Chimigwich.
Chimigwich, Carolyn. So for those of you who are new to our community, Shared Path is a charitable organization working towards a future in which Indigenous voices, obligations, and rights form a sustained and integral part of how we share land and water, particularly with respect to land use planning, policy, law, and governance in Ontario. So Carolyn mentioned, to reflect on the territory that you're on and the treaty relationships that you might have. So something that we can all do to help move towards this vision of shared paths is to take a moment to consider the territory we are on, the nations that are hosting us, and what relationship or obligations we may have through treaties. Personally, I'm tuning in today from Lunuaki or Mi'kma'ki, the Atlantic side of the country, which has been and shall always be the unceded territory of the Lenape or Mi'kmaq people. The territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which was signed by the Lenape Wolastoqiyik, also known as Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy nations, and these were signed between 1760 and 1761. These treaties did not surrender rights to lands and resources. Rather, they recognized the Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik right to hunt, fish, and farm, and earn a reasonable living without British interference. And these treaties are still in effect today, and they've been making the news over the past year and a half or so as Mi'kmaq communities have tried to set up fisheries to exercise their rights and have, in many cases, been met by hostility. So in some instances, the hostility is a result of a misunderstanding of our treaty relationship and obligations. In other instances, it is a result of deep-seated racism. And today we're going to talk about how the latter has shaped planning in Ontario and how we might go about undoing racism in planning towards Indigenous people specifically. So thank you, Carolyn, again for doing that opening. I also want to relay a few housekeeping notes before we get started. As attendees, your cameras and mics are off, so others won't hear or see you, but we invite you to submit questions by typing them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. There's an option there to submit questions anonymously if that's what you choose, and we will address as many questions as we can at the end of the discussion. This webinar is being recorded, and an edited version will be made available on our YouTube channel. Now, with those notes out of the way, I think it is now my pleasure to introduce Bob Goulais, who will be moderating our panel today. Bob is Anishnaabe from Nipissing First Nation. He is a second-degree member of the Three Fires Midwaywan Society and a committed advocate of Indigenous ways of knowing and being. He's a sought-after speaker, a traditional teacher, facilitator, and master of ceremonies, providing valuable cultural context and traditional knowledge to diverse audiences across Canada. In 2015, he founded Nbisiing Consulting, Inc., and specializes in Indigenous community engagement, communications, cultural advisory services, cultural competency training, public policy, and management consulting. Many of you are familiar with Bob. He's done a lot of work in Ontario with many of the people that we also work with. And he also provides direct services to many clients in the areas of land use planning and urban planning. So you might have come across him in those fields. He's an experienced senior executive and consultant. He's provided over 20 years of leadership to the public service, to industry, government, for-profits and not-for-profits, Indigenous organizations, including the Anishnaabe Nation, the Assembly of First Nations, the Government of Ontario, Native Men's Residence, Humber College, and Ojibwe Culture Foundation. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Bob.
Chimigwech Morgan, that is a really long bio, and I apologize for that. I'm going to have to really keep an eye on those things. Well, I'm going to introduce myself in my traditional way as a Anishnaabe and Innis, and using the Anishnaabe Mwin or Ojibwe Mwin language, the Ojibwe language. Bojo nindwe magana dok minwan ni kanasadok mjakwet ndishnakas migizi indodem. My Anishnaabe name is Mjakwet, which refers to that place in the cloud world where this physical earth has that barrier where we start to see that spirit realm. That's where my name comes from the cloud world. I'm of the Eagle clan, the Bald Eagle clan. Nbisiing Ojibwe Anishnaabe and Taugani, Minwa Nipissing First Nation, Yindonje. I identify as Nbisiing Anishnaabe, and that's that place we call Nipissing First Nation, a little place called Taugani, or Garden Village is where I'm from. And Nibih is our word for water. And when we use the word Nbisiing, it's the diminutive form of that word water. So the word Nbisiing or Nipissing is the word for small water. And if you look at the Lake Nipissing, it is quite a bit smaller than the neighboring Great Lakes to it. My English name is Bob Goulais. Happy to be with you today and happy to be your moderator, your facilitator, as we go through this great panel. This panel that we are going to be talking about those issues that Indigenous people, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit face with regard to anti-Indigenous racism and where that happens. And oftentimes we think of racism, we think of those overt forms of racism. You think of those exchanges that are derogatory and offensive to our people. But in a lot of cases, that racism is very much structural. Use the term institutional if you'd like, or systemic. Those forms of racism are a part of everyday life for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. It is part of how we become a part of this land use planning. And I think one of the best examples is the Planning Act itself. and the profession of planning. That is entirely 100% created from a non-Indigenous perspective, or that colonial perspective. And it's important to keep that in mind, that we are continuing to move on a form of planning, a whole profession, a whole systemic process that's been entirely created in that colonial mindset. So part of the challenge today, and part of the challenge of organizations such as Shared Path, is to start looking at things from the perspective and worldview of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And that's where I like to do a lot of my work. Those of you, I see a lot of you there. How many do we have in our, it looks like we have 97 people participating so far. I know many of you. I see folks from Urban Strategies. I see folks from the City of Toronto, a few other folks that I work with on a regular basis. And I know a lot of you are committed to decolonizing this planning space, to do what you can within your sphere of influence to bring about the perspectives and worldview of Indigenous peoples. I started we started our day off with those words from Carolyn King, those words that are said to be come before all other words, where we acknowledge the spirit, we thank the spirit, we use those words "chumi-wech," to thank the spirit for this way of life, for our culture, for our worldview, to thank the spirit and thank for that our ancestors for what they've brought us today. You know, that is part of that worldview. That is a part of that knowledge. And how we see the earth around us is incredibly important. And, you know, we all need to take our place and play our role in integrating that Indigenous traditional knowledge, worldview, culture, and that incredible Anishnaabe Oddswin, that way of life, into these things that we do in land use planning. So that's my challenge that I put out to you, is start to look at things from an Indigenous perspective. Commit to lifelong learning. And when it comes to anti-Indigenous racism, commit to personal sustained action. When you hear and see racism, even it might not be overt, it might be, systemic in some way, question that, raise it, create that sense of action, that sense of duty towards eliminating that anti-Indigenous racism. So we've got three great panelists that are going to provide us that knowledge today. And the form of this panel, we're going to offer 10 or 15 minutes to each of the three panelists to provide their oratory. And oratory is a way of our people, that we share in that way. And it's taken the form of online presentations and Zoom and PowerPoint, but it still comes from that knowledge that we've acquired. And that will be about 10 or 15 minutes. And then we've got a few questions already prepared, and then we're going to take some of your questions. So maybe don't put your questions quite yet. Listen to some of the speakers first. And then if you do have any questions, we encourage you to use the Q&A feature just down below in the toolbox there. Open up that Q&A feature, perhaps suggest a question. And if you see questions on there that you really want to see an answer for, you can upvote it by clicking on and extending your like or your preference to those questions. So that's how we're going to do things. I'm going to introduce you to each of the panelists, and then I'm going to call upon, likely I'm going to call upon Carolyn first, followed by Heather, and then Aaron. So I'm going to introduce Carolyn King first. So Carolyn King and I have go back a long, long time. I was involved in the first powwows that came to Mississaugas of the Credit back in the late 80s. That's a long time ago, Carolyn. And then certainly got to know Carolyn and her husband, the late Fred, in a really good way, and beautiful, beautiful people, Carolyn. And Carolyn, as she mentioned, is also been the past chief of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation back in December of 1997. She's spent over 30 years of her experience working in First Nations community and economic development, extensive experience in public relations. She founded the community advocacy radio group, fostering and encouraging community radio development. She's been on the founding boards and one of the founders of the radio station in Six Nations as well. She's also been awarded the Queen Elizabeth II's Diamond Jubilee Award in 2012. She's also been recently extended to the Order of Canada in 2020. So we're very proud of her and what she's accomplished. She's also the founder of the Moccasin Identifier Project. So give us a big warm welcome to Carolyn King. So give her a round of applause wherever you are. I'm also going to introduce you to Heather Dorries. Dr. Heather Dorries is of Anishnaabe and settler ancestry from Saugeen First Nation in Treaty 1 territory in that beautiful part of the country. She's an assistant professor jointly appointed to the Department of Geography and the Department of Planning and the Center for Indigenous Studies at the University of Toronto. And I'm very proud of U of T. I got two boys there as we speak. Her research focuses on the relationship between urban planning and settler colonialism. So she's got a lot to offer in this conversation about decolonizing, examining how Indigenous intellectual traditions, including environmental knowledge, legal orders, and cultural production can serve as a foundation to justice-oriented approaches. So a big round of applause and welcome to Dr. Heather Dorries. Welcome, Heather. And last but not least, Aaron St. Pierre. He's Associate Director of Indigenous Initiatives at Queen's University. He's the former Executive Director in my part of the territory, the Native people of Nipissing's Housing Corporation. Aaron is from Moose Deer Point First Nation. He is currently serves as the Vice President of the Board of Directors of the Native people of Sudbury Development Housing Corporation. So still quite involved in housing as well as in lands management. He's the chairperson of Moose Deer Point First Nation's Lands Management Committee. So a big round of applause to Aaron St. Pierre. And we're very Anishnaabe centric in this panel, but as panels happen, there's going to be a lot of other diverse voices as well. But Carolyn King is also representing the Haudenosaunee side of her too, so we've got some representation there. So I'm going to turn it over to Carolyn. If I can ask the panelists to open up your, make sure you have a timepiece beside you. And I can give you, 10, 15 minutes. We've got a lot of time. So perhaps take as much time as you need, that 15 minutes, but ask you to keep your eyes on the time. So I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, and that'll be Carolyn King. So over to you, Carolyn. Oh, you're on mute though, Carolyn.
Okay. All right, we're back in business. Yeah, been having out here in the rural area. We're in the middle of everything in Southern Ontario, but we still have major connection problems. So me and the tech were having a good conversation this morning, trying to make sure I was able to connect and hopefully stay connected. So at any rate, like I said, thank you for joining us. Definitely been involved in the system, I'll call it, as Bob mentioned about, a lot of the issues that develop are structural or institutional. And us as First Nations, I can only talk from the First Nation side. I'm born and raised on Six Nations, married into the Mississaugas of the Credit, and left fourth line and I live on first line. So I haven't been too far from the Indian Reserve scenario, and worked for the First Nation in doing its community planning, economic development, and have seen a part of all of that. Just kind of did the foundation work here to carry out our plan, and still working on those kinds of things. Still very much involved with I'm the president of the radio station, back doing that. And that we're, you say, well, why do we have a radio station? One of the things is exactly what happens institutionally. The radio stations and Native radio is in a block, like with community, what do you call it, college radio, university radio, campus radio, they call it. And so we have a special licensing, and It was promoted back in the mid 80s that in the 80s that we, start a radio station, and those low power radio stations are the sole, and you have to get a license to get one, and you have to kind of do language. They line you up to do just same. It's no different than the fishing issues that we get in different places of this country, where it is for sustainability. You can only do to keep yourself going. The radio station communications in this country is controlled by CRTC, and that it aligns you to sit in a box, and you can't compete against anybody else. When we just till recently, we were confined to sort of like 5 minutes of advertising per hour, and we could not compete with the adjacent signals. So the same thing happens with our land. When we look to do things with our land, either we got to have all the money to do it on our own, because like what I found in my years of trying to develop things on the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations lands, is that we were up against the system, that land use system that doesn't recognize us as part of Ontario. And it goes to that part that we're federal lands, and that the municipalities believe, I'll say, that they don't have to deal with the First Nations land. And I always tell the story about I get to attack Haldeman, who's adjacent to us and surrounds us on two sides. And that, when they did their land use planning, they took the reserve lands and put a big black label across it and said, limitation to our development. So that's the way they look at us. They no longer can get access to our lands. And the structural institutional law backs that up. Oh no, we don't have to deal with them. And that, and that's still ongoing today. And that until we change the law, saying that people are going to do what they want to do to get what they want. And that's the taking of land for whatever reason, for more housing development in Ontario, or for access to land for roadways to support that housing development, pipelines, railroad tracks, all of those come into play, and they may have to cross our treaty lands, our reserve lands, or our traditional territories, and impact the way that we use them. And it's been historically the context that, if we thought we could hunt and fish and gather, that's not the case in the minds of the municipality, the residents, the people who've come to live here and bought the land through the government and consider it theirs. So ongoing, and keep trying to educate. That's when I talk about being a radio station, doing the library, working on supporting programs like Shared Path, where we have to keep telling the story about what has happened to us in this country, and that it's still ongoing. And I believe that it starts with communication and dialogue that we're having today. We put ourselves out there and put our scenarios, in front of people about what we can do, and until somebody comes and starts to work with us, and they go because they'll say, how come you can't do this, you can't do that? And then when you try, well, you try it, and they realize the barriers that we're up against. I've worked with many people over the years and say, I can't believe they act like this. When they, as a non-native educated person who goes to the table for us, and then they hit the roadblocks, and it's like, then they realize for sure what we're up against when we try to want to make use of, exercise our treaty rights or our cultural rights to do things, whether that's, spiritual grounds, whether it's resource, where you get hunting and fishing and gathering involved. And that, so it's always been a structural thing. And I got to share, a fellow board member, Dave Stinson, and I, Dave belongs to the OPPI. He might be online with us today, but him and I, through Dave, we got connected to the Canadian Land Association. And we did a presentation in November to Newfoundland. And they had their government person for the Aboriginal Indigenous department make a presentation. And that, so he was, you just think about this, he was talking to the planners who were on that program. So it was, he presented the Land Use Act that they have in Newfoundland and Labrador. And so he's advising them almost, I mean, I was very angry, got very angry listening to him talk about this is the way it is. And if you don't want to have to deal with the First Nations, they only have 5 communities there that they're and the Inuit, and that, you know, it was like, well, if you don't want to have to deal with them, don't go near this area. It's federal land, you know, and if it's federal reserve, like national parks or harbors or airports, like you have to do an environmental assessment. If you don't want to do an environmental assessment, don't go there, or be prepared to work, have to work with them. Statements like that from the government of that area that gives the planner the almost like the path to go around is very disturbing. And it was only, I was going to address it right in this in the webinar, but I was, I mean, they invited us to go speak and listen, and Dave and I presented about Ontario. But at the end, his only saving grace was that he said, after I didn't know much until I got to this department, he carried out the Labrador Agreement, like big stuff that he's done. And he said, it's only after working with him that I realized that they need assistance and help. And he'd be willing to do that. Otherwise, I was going to tell him off in a national conference. But when you think about that, the structure, I wouldn't say Ontario, just put Ontario in there. Is our government going around telling the provinces, here's what you got to do, here's what you got to do, you know, type thing? We're not going to get there unless the law changes. And I agree that it's institutional, it's structural, it's in the law of this land. And as we move forward to make changes in the way that we are required to work with each other in the law, we're not going to get too much further, you know, unless we're giving up something to them, which I don't think we're going to do anymore. And that we've given up everything as to where we are today. So I think we need some strategic planning about how we are going to move forward in all of this. And I think that the talk and the dialogue that we have with Shared Path, and people are asking now, they realize we got some major Supreme Court rulings, we got ONVRA, we got the Truth and Reconciliation. I say we come through the door with a big stick now. So let's talk about what the future will be for us, and that we can, you know, live the way that we choose to live in our communities, our First Nations, or in our, you know, centers where people who live off reserve, and how they talk. They may not get into the land use issues like the First Nations do, because they own land just like the non-native people. But you know, there's lots of considerations to be done, and you know, I've been part of it, and fortunately been recognized for pushing for better initiatives. And you see my little moccasin identifier up there on the wall behind me. That program is about communication, education, and awareness, and an easy, unique way to teach the next generation about whose land they're on. That's based on treaty. We ask the classrooms we ask a school to have teach students lessons about what treaties are, and that's already in the curriculum. And then they can go out on paper, inside or outside, and they stencil, a little fun game, graffiti type game, and they stencil a moccasin design for the specific area they're in, and that they do it, it washes away, and they'll do it again next year. I said, I have a dream too, that in 10 years, this province is going to be covered with moccasin identifiers, and they will forever know whose land they're on. So in that planning world, they got to deal with me, and I'm just looking to paint the paint the countryside with or the city with moccasin identifiers. And I'll tell you, things are going well. Our little program is expanding and thriving. We can't keep up. We're even doing some national projects and have some inquiries there. So, I always keep asking people to help with that. And that municipalities, if I stenciled in Toronto, and I'm a graffiti artist now because I went and stencils on the street when they said I didn't have permission to. So, what are we going to do? I hope that you think about the things that the First Nations want to do, the Indigenous people would like to be, how they want to be part of the system. It doesn't mean that we want to be just like you. We want to be who we are. And I think that stems from, the desire for all of us who want to, help improve our world to do. So I certainly invite you to join us. Join Shared Path, join my Marcus and Identifier team, and join my community radio stuff, and we'll continue to change the world. Miigwech.
Oh, miigwech, Carolyn. Thank you so much. I got a first question to you, Carolyn, before I go to Dr. Heather Dorries. Question about, when is it appropriate to speak out? I know you're very outspoken, so but you have to pick and choose those opportunities, and for those, and really see who's receptive to hearing that. So how would you advise others to, if they encounter those kind of systemic racism and those kinds of comments that the people saying them may not even be aware that it invokes that feeling from First Nations? How would you suggest that you approach folks that make these comments?
For me, I think I'm pretty friendly and easy to talk to. I do have strong opinions and have worked, a lifetime on this work, and that I just talk to them, or I tell people, you need to learn something. If they didn't come to the table knowing something, and I would say, before you go meet that First Nation, you need to research them. Like, us as the Mississaugas, besides Six Nations, you have no idea how many times consultants and visitors come and say, oh, I want to meet the chief of the Six Nations. Well, you're in the wrong place. Yeah. Or they send us, we receive bid proposals, and it has other First Nations in there. They don't even check to see who they're talking to. And that, oh, I didn't know that you weren't the same. Like, that kind of stuff. And so I have another program called Indian 101. I tell people, you need to take my Indian 101 so you understand the differences. And I do it nicely, and I try to be as easy and open and helpful.
Beautiful.
As helpful as possible.
I agree with that, Carolyn. And I think that advice is really important, is get to know who you're wanting to talk to. Develop that relationship. Take the Indigenous Cultural Competency course or Indigenous 101, and commit to lifelong learning. That's such good advice. Miigwech, Carolyn. A big round of applause to Carolyn King. Miigwech, Carolyn. That's what I miss about doing this face-to-face, is you don't hear the big applause that we're hearing on the other side of Zoom. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Heather Dorries, who's Anishnaabe from Saugeen and assistant professor at University of Toronto. So over to you, Heather.
Great. Thanks, Bob. Thanks to everyone. It's great to see so many familiar names in the attendee list, if not faces. I'm speaking to you today from Toronto, the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I think it's important to do these acknowledgements. They've become more and more common, and there's been some criticism of the fact that land acknowledgements are becoming, a common thing, but also very rote thing. People acknowledge where they are and then move on to the order of the day, and often these acknowledgements don't end up meaning very much. After they've been recited. But I think one of our challenges as planners and people who work in the sphere of planning and land use is to really think about what it means to begin the work that we do with these acknowledgements, and what it means to honor the relationships that they are suggestive of. I think there's I think these acknowledgements can be a pathway into education. When I think back to the planning education that I received at the U of T, where I now work, I didn't hear anything about Indigenous peoples. I think the message that I got was that they're first of all, they were never mentioned, right? Indigenous peoples were never mentioned, which I think implied that, you know, land was open for the taking, open to be developed as a terra nullius, open for planners to decide what should be done with that, open for developers to decide what should be done with the lands that they were purchasing. And, you know, as of right development means you don't need to think about the histories of that land or the relations that are embedded in the land. And I have come to see this as a form of racism. You know, I think Bob gave us a really good definition at the beginning, or a good reminder that, you know, there's interpersonal racism, which is easy to observe. That's racism that occurs between people, like maybe you're being treated badly at the store, or in some kind of interpersonal interaction, and that's usually quite easy to see. It's something we feel in the interaction. We have an emotional response. We feel badly afterwards if we're experiencing it. And structural racism, I think, can be a little bit harder to see, and that's when these ideas, the prejudices that are behind interpersonal racism, become embedded in processes. They become part of institutional requirements or conditions or practices or policies or processes that end up maintaining and reproducing unfair inequalities or bad treatment of particular ethnic or racial groups. And that can be often more difficult to see, because there might not be any particular person perpetrating that. It's just baked into the policies and practices that are shaping our conduct. And so in this case, the connection between planning and racism is often masked, or the relationship. And at the same time, I think the relationship between planning and Indigenous people is often masked, because there's often this assumption like that, well, you know, Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities, First Nations communities are not, you know, part of planning processes, or with the questions of policies or laws related to Indigenous people are the responsibility of, or the jurisdiction of the federal government. As municipalities, people working at the local planning level don't have any obligations there. And I think that is one way that you know, some of the ways that structural racism begins to be reproduced in planning, when Indigenous communities, issues, concerns, relations to land start to become ignored. I think another way that racist ideas are perpetuated and influence planning is through the media and the ideas and stories that get told about Indigenous peoples and communities. And if we look back throughout Canadian history, many of the major flashpoints in Canada, Indigenous relations have been precipitated by municipal planning decisions. If we look at Oka, we look at Caledonia, those were precipitated by decisions taken at the municipal level, land use decisions, right? The decision to turn burial ground into a golf course at Oka, the decisions to develop land at Caledonia, land that was part of a land claim. And if we look at media reporting on these types of issues, the land stories, right, the real foundations of these conflicts are not told as planning issues. They're spoken about as issues of lawlessness in Indigenous communities. There's a Métis scholar, Jennifer Deasy, who's really carefully studied the media on reporting on these kinds of issues, and has found that there's a really crafted and specific narrative that is perpetuated about Indigenous peoples as terrorists, as internal terrorist threats. And this is a language that gets used a lot to describe these kinds of incidents. And this is important and significant because talking about Indigenous peoples in this way, describing them as terrorists, right, on one hand is a way of saying, like, they're not part of Canada, they're not part of our public discourse and decision making, but also it invites really heavy-handed police responses, right? And in both of those cases, Oka and Caledonia, we see, not just a heavy-handed police response, but a military response. Audrey Simpson points out that if the military intervention at Oka was the largest deployment of the Canadian military at that time since the Korean War, right? So it's quite significant. And we can look at these, and I think a lot of people won't look back at this and say, well, this is related to planning as part of our planning history in this country. But I think once we start to think about the roots of some of these conflicts, we do see, I think these conflicts really underscore the importance of planning and the importance of planners to think about, their role and relation to Indigenous peoples and communities. So I was so concerned with making sure I unmuted myself that I forgot to start my timer. So maybe I have more to say, but maybe I'll just conclude because I know Bob has a couple of questions and I want to give Aaron time to speak as well, but I'll conclude there. So thank you very much.
All right, miigwech, Heather. You did have a couple of minutes, but I do have a question specifically for you because of your expertise in land use planning and the profession of land use planning. Is the issue with regard to, you mentioned the issue of lawlessness and the perception that we're terrorists, is the issue of structural racism related to policy, or is it more about perception? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's both, right? I think these things go hand in hand. I think policies and laws are tools that are available to be used, but they're not completely neutral. Well, they're not neutral at all, right? And they can be used in different ways, depending on your objectives. They are tools that can be used in different ways. Like on the one hand, I think the tools available to planners to address these issues, the tools available to First Nations and Indigenous peoples to address these issues are not adequate, right? There's more that can be done in terms of shaping laws and policies and shaping the statutory planning framework in ways that will benefit all of us in better ways. But at the same time, I think approaching what the tools and policies, the laws that we have available to us at the current moment could also produce a difference if we just approach some of these tools in a different way with a different spirit.
Excellent point. I think, yeah, looking at tools and policy as a means of overcoming some of these challenges is certainly, I think optimistic, but I think that's the future of what reconciliation is and the role of land use planning and land use planners in that. And then hopefully that overcomes those perceptions they have of Indigenous people and perceptions that we're in the way of development, whereas, we can be a part of that land use work and a part of that process. So thank you very much. A big round of applause for Dr. Heather Dorries. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to my good friend, Aaron St. Pierre, Associate Director of Indigenous Initiatives at Queen's, and Anishnaabe from Moose Deer Point. So over to you, Aaron.
Aaron St. Pierre, Anishnaabe, Medodem, Moose Point, First Nation, Donjaba. So in my language, in Ojibwe, it just means hello, my name's Aaron. I'm from Sturgeon Clan and I'm from Moose Point. I guess the first thing I wanted to sort of bring up, because in my current role, I'm the Associate Director for Indigenous Initiatives at Queen's University. And the central mission of our office is to decolonize and indigenize the institution. That's a whole topic on its own. I won't get too much into that, but when we're talking about decolonization and we talk about we use these kinds of terms, I think there's a lot of, some people might be confused, or they might, not really understand what's meant by that. And I think when we're talking about decolonization, it's actually a really simple process, a really simple idea. It's a contrast from the colonial type of system that we live in, the Western capitalist, framework, ideology that has sort of shaped all of our laws and shaped, Western Canadian society. It's a contrast with that, in that when you decolonize your institution, or when you decolonize your laws, your policies, all these types of things, you're looking at it with an Indigenous lens, an Indigenous perspective. And there's a little bit of, I do want to caution that there is no single Indigenous identity. There's no single Indigenous culture, worldview or anything like that. But there are some similarities. And I think one similarity that cuts across Indigenous cultures is the emphasis on our relations with each other and our relations with the land. And I think that's probably, that's really what's meant when we're talking about decolonizing. We are not, whereas in Western capitalist colonial ideology, the individual is centered, and there's sort of the main modus operandi to the whole thing is, extracting as much value as you can out of the land and out of people and out of, extracting things as much as you can. Whereas when you're decolonizing and when you're approaching things from the Indigenous perspective, the thing you're emphasizing is your relationships with people and your relationships with the land, and having good relations with people in the land. So, to boil down a really complex academic type of word and subject, that's what it is. It's just it's trying to treat the land better, it's treat the people around you better. And so that's basically what I wanted to touch on there. But so with reference to land use planning specifically, so as I mentioned, I'm from Moose Point First Nation, and I would just like to share a quick history of the early years of my community and sort of where it came from, and it's sort of help highlight where some of these issues that came from, where the current issues with land use planning came from with regards to things like First Nations reserves. So Moose Point First Nation was established legally by the Canadian government in 1917. The community was a few hundred people, and it was granted 600 acres on the coastline of what is now called Georgian Bay in Mississaugas in Ontario, so central Ontario. And so it was created around this time. It was given 3 separate parcels, very small parcels of land for considering how many people live there. And that in of itself isn't that interesting. It's what at the same time, there was another organization that got established in this right adjacent to the reserve. It was a hunting and fishing club. It was called the Tadnak Club, or it's still in operation. And it was established by 5 wealthy Toronto businessmen who were basically the very well connected, very well established in Toronto, Ontario, white Western society. So these were gentlemen who owned, some of the largest businesses. One of them was a Supreme Court justice. So that's who established this club. And around the same time frame, so 1895 was when they established the Tadnak Club. They were granted what came to eventually 7,000 acres in comparison to the First Nations community, which was only given 600 acres. And they were established around the same time. So it's sort of, just a contrast that, these two different communities, I guess you could call them, were established right next to each other. And, the treatment that the government gave towards these different groups was, so there was such a massive disparity, and and the ease in which the Tabernacle Club was able to acquire the land was a huge contrast. They essentially just had to write a letter to the Minister of Lands and Forests, and it was done in a relatively short time. Whereas for Moose, to your point, the community, they had been lobbying the government to receive some legal recognition and legal lands for 50 years prior to 1917. So it was a very long, drawn out process, and in the end, they received a much smaller amount of land. And on top of that too, the Tabernacle Club, which still exists today, was founded to provide basically a private game and fishing reserve for these individuals. It was established with the stated intent to protecting the fish and game in the area. And I guess this would be from the First Nations people, or from other hunters and fishers in the area. And unique to this property too, they were also given exclusive access to the surface of the water. So I don't know, in Canada, you can't own the water. Basically, you can take your boat right up to somebody's cottage, park it right in front of there, and legally they can't say anything about that. But not in this case, not in the Tabernacle, not on the Tabernacle property. So. That's sort of like understanding that history, I think, is really important to understanding where we are today, and why, where these land claims come from, where, where a lot of the strife and a lot of the issues are based in these types of injustices. They're based in these events that happened not in ancient history either. These are, this was 100 years ago. This was not from time immemorial. This is a few generations back. So I think going forward, it's important to have those things in mind, especially as we attempt to, decolonize our policies and things like that, but also, where the conversations about land back come from and these types of things. So, but I'll leave it there, and thanks for having me.
Miigwech, Aaron, thanks very much. And give a big round of applause to Aaron St. Pierre, and as well as Heather and Carolyn. Thank you very much for your wisdom. Again, if you have any questions, please add them to the Q&A. We do have a few questions to go to. And I'm going to start with Aaron, because I asked Heather and Carolyn a question. So I'm going to start you with the first one, and I might ask Heather and Carolyn for their input on this as well. So Aaron, how has systemic racism been made evident in planning specifically? And what do planners need to do or understand to begin to overcoming that racism, to begin to overcome the racism?
So with respect to planning specifically, so in the case of I'd say, so I'm going to relate this back to, in my prior work, I was the executive director for Native People Nipissing Housing Corporation, which offered not-for-profit housing in North Bay, Ontario. And a lot of the challenges that come from that presented themselves specifically in regards to social housing, were basically the treatment. I would say that an Indigenous organization would receive in its dealings with, the municipality, for instance, when it came to land use planning. What municipal government is sort of by design not built to deal with Indigenous organizations in any meaningful way or in a good way. The federal government, for all its flaws and for the problems there, has a fiduciary responsibility to consult and work with First Nations groups, and has sort of a historic relationship, whereas municipalities don't have that. In a municipal charter or in provincial legislation regarding municipalities, there isn't there isn't anything codified anywhere to say that municipalities need to have any sort of relationship with First Nations groups. So when an urban Indigenous organization is trying to work with a municipality, what the municipality ends up doing in almost all cases is tries to work with the First Nations or Indigenous group as it would with any other group. And I think that's it's sort of that's sort of the root cause of a lot of the problems. Because often Indigenous organizations, they are created to they have specific needs. They have a specific, there's a specific culture. There's specific needs to the organization itself that aren't respected and aren't thought of when municipalities are trying to, when they're working with groups. They often just try to treat them like everyone else, and that's not the sort of relationship that's needed in that case.
Really good point there. And I think, the whole aspect of equity versus equality has kind of been bent out of shape to make everyone feel that, when it comes to policy, that everyone is all the same, that we need to treat everyone all the same, not considerate of the aspect of constitutional rights or treaty rights or Aboriginal rights, or even the balancing out the historical inequities that have occurred over the years. So, that's certainly evident in planning. Same question to you, Heather. How has systemic racism been made evident in planning, and what do planners need to do to begin to overcome those aspects of racism?
Muted. Yeah, so I want to address that question, and at the same time, I'm going to address the question, one of the questions in the Q&A about laws that need to change. And I think if we're looking at the Ontario's statutory planning framework, so that framework of laws and policies that shape planning processes and practices in Ontario, we can see, I think, an example of systemic racism, although those policies and practices are changing. And I think these policies and laws need to change, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm talking about the Provincial Policy Statement. I'm talking about the Planning Act. The Provincial Policy Statement was recently amended to provide this reminder to planners that I'm usually pretty good at just reciting those words. Maybe someone else on the panel can do it, but it's reminding planners that they have an obligation to plan with Indigenous people's rights in mind. I'm sure David Stinson's going to pop into the chat and tell me exactly what it is. And then if we look at the Planning Act, I mean, for a very long time, there was no mention of Indigenous peoples or First Nations communities at all. There was a change made in the 90s that said that municipalities had an obligation to notify First Nations if they were going to be undertaking any activities within 1 kilometer of a reserve. So that act limited Indigenous or Aboriginal rights, Aboriginal and treaty rights to the space of the reserve, and then set the bar for engagement for relationship building as pure notification. So you send a letter, good. And while these things are changing, the steps have been really, really tiny. And I think what we've seen in Ontario, if we look at how municipalities are creating plans, we look at the amount of engagement that's actually taking place, there's improvements happening, but it's at a very slow pace. And we need the statutory planning framework to change, right? We need the guidance from other orders of government in order for people to know what they need to be doing. And we need to be having, I think, more serious conversations about that. And I think there's many ways that racism is shaping the way these changes are taking place. I think, as Aaron's was talking about, I think there's also the question of like who's benefiting from development and why are certain people not interested in seeing these changes take place. So that's my answer.
Heather. And Carolyn, I was going to go to you with that question. So the question is, what would Carolyn say about what laws need to change, Carolyn? So Heather says the provincial policy statement, that's a start, I think, but there's so many laws that need those changes. What would you say needs to change in terms of legislation, Carolyn?
I think that all of those ministers and people who are in the government need to get an education. They get voted in for their specific area that they're going to be how they're represented, right? And they may never have been near an Indian reserve or had to deal with it. And that when they don't know and they support, legislation or changes or push something to get changed, they, they come from such a maybe unknowing. As stated earlier, they don't even know that they're doing wrong until somebody, taps them on the shoulder or, asks them to leave the room for their comments and statements. I think it needs to change at the top. And we're a long way down the road now from where we were. I've been around working in the First Nations since 1980 as a community economic development. So I've seen a lot. We've grown, we've challenged the system about what we're going to do. And I don't know, just a quick note, I went to Halden one time and we were getting our 59 acres and turning it into reserve land, and they were opposing it. And I went there and I took our plan to them. I mean, this is the 80s that I did that. And I said, here's our plan. Here's what we want to do. We've followed the process. We're telling you what we're doing, and we go to the table there. And I said, they go like, okay, thanks. And I said, well, we're going to develop. And you benefit from us developing. So what is it? I said, we're going to develop in front of the trees or behind them. So what is it? Nobody said anything. You know what? It's racism. It's prejudice. They don't want us to go ahead. And they benefit from all of the First Nations who are adjacent to those municipalities or towns and stuff, because we go spend all our money there and they get to provide service to us. And they don't want to see that change. I could write a story about some of the things that we had to go through to get 59 acres out of the, the mainstream land and stuff. But one of the things that I see, they don't react. Right now, the Six Nations, the Haudenosaunee, HDI, they declared a moratorium on any development in the 6 Mile Tract. And the elected council actually a couple of weeks after backed them up and said, we agree with that moratorium. Has that stopped anything? No. They're still building. We got a MZO thing up in Cambridge. They still built, other major developments is going forward. You just look at that planning, the things that are going forward. I try to monitor what's happening in the planning groups around us. They just keep going. So my question is, why don't you stop when we say no? We said no to the Tom Howell landfill site. They didn't stop. And so we had to go to protests, and we have to go to mediated talks. And next thing was court, to say, you can't keep doing this. Why is it the width of a road 66 feet versus 500 feet for the white people across the road? They can't live beside the landfill site, but it's okay to put it that close to an Indian reserve and think that we're going to say nothing about it. And it's across those provinces. It happens not just at New Credit, happens to other municipalities, other First Nations, that they put their garbage beside us and think it's okay. So what do we, and they wonder why we get upset when there's a double standard like that. And everybody doesn't know why that happens. They didn't change the law, but that's that whole federal and versus the Provincial Land and the Land Use Act.
Yeah.
The rules to do that, like they don't listen. And that's what gets us upset when we talk like this, and that we want to make the changes. It has to start from the top, whether it's the federal government who has to dictate to the province and say, you have to do this. Here's the law. And I say that the law, the rules, and why don't they respond to a Supreme Court ruling? We see Supreme Court rulings on a lot of different things, and the world starts to change. Maybe it takes five years or something like that, but we're not seeing it on landing. It needs to somehow or another, that needs to get driven into the heart of the people to say, we no longer go forward without talking to the First Nations or looking at the Indigenous population and how this is going to affect them. I say that they all need to have the rose-colored glasses, and they need to ask the question, how will this affect the First Nations? Until we get there, we're not going to get there. Until we're not going to succeed. As Heather said, tiny steps are being made. We need to make a lot more tiny steps. My position on that.
I see a few questions that I'm going to kind of lump into one question for the panelists, and it's really good. I believe by virtue of some of these questions that are there, there's a whole lot in our audience of looks like 80 people now that are looking for some guidance. They're looking for some answers on some questions that are so fundamental. The question is, how do we approach Indigenous communities when drafting an official plan? How do we incorporate Indigenous rights into a policy when there's no First Nation or Métis communities within the municipality? And so some of those questions I think can be answered by a three-prong approach, a three-prong answer. First answer, and then I'm going to get your opinions and ideas from the panelists. Number one, you need to be inclusive of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. So, how do we be inclusive? It's through developing relationships and creating awareness, educating yourself on Indigenous peoples and Indigenous awareness. So I'm gonna seek out your ideas on this, but how do those answers answer your question? Well, when it comes to how do we approach Indigenous communities when drafting an official policy or official plan, that can happen easily if you already have a relationship with those First Nations or Métis communities. How do we incorporate Indigenous rights into policy if there's no communities within the municipality? Your municipality is on Indigenous traditional territory. There may not be a reserve there, there may not be a Métis community, but it is Indigenous territory. All of Canada is Indigenous traditional territory. So you'll need to become educated of which First Nation is of that territory. So I'm going to ask the panelists, starting with Aaron, how do we be inclusive? How do we establish relationships? How do we become educated on Indigenous matters? So what are your thoughts and tips of advice, Aaron?
Sure. Yeah, so I think it's a good question. I think it's important to highlight too that the offers, there's sorry, I lost my train of thought there. The Indigenous community in Canada more and more resides off reserve. So, when we're having these discussions, it's important to include and think of, First Nations communities themselves, like on reserve communities. But the fact is most Indigenous peoples now live off reserve in urban centers. So, there might not be a reserve right close by to your city, but I guarantee you there are many Indigenous peoples living within your city or within your community. So in that case, what I would suggest too is that I would look for, you don't have to look for an official First Nations community. You could look for things like a friendship center. You could look for, urban Indigenous organizations that are, within, that primarily serve and work with the communities within cities and towns and things like that. So there's usually some sort of focal point for the Indigenous community in that region where they congregate and where they come together. So that would be my suggestion.
Good advice, Aaron. How about you, Heather? Do you have any advice on being inclusive, establishing relationships, or getting a bit of education on these matters?
When I've talked to people, and when I've heard from people working for planners for municipalities where they feel like they have a good relationship, right? Those are often relationships that started early, right? Before they were working on the OP, before they were pursuing development, before they had, plans that were going to impact the First Nation, they had gone out, someone, and it takes an individual often to do this work. Someone had gone out, introduced themselves, maybe they had coffee with someone from leadership from the First Nation, and started building a relationship the way you would with any other person or group where you don't know them, right? You start slow, you get to know them. I recently moved into a new place, and I didn't immediately start off by asking my neighbor for a bunch of favors. I started out by introducing myself, and we chatted a few times, and we're getting to the point where I might ask him to bring in my mail if I'm away, but that's not how I started out. And I think these same principles apply. Maybe it seems silly, but we're talking about people at the end of the day. So, I think the same kinds of principles need to apply. Now, there's more work to do in terms of educating yourself about the history, about the politics that is going to be going into shaping these relationships, but just don't keep in mind that what you're doing is building relationships, right?
Thanks very much, Heather. And the same question to you, Carolyn. Any other advice? You've already provided us suggestions on Indian 101 or Indigenous 101. Any other ways that you can foster good relationships, or perhaps improve relationships between municipalities and First Nations?
Okay, thanks. First, I'll give a plug for Shared Path. We are looking to be like a little clearinghouse of where planners, municipalities can go and look. There are lots of history of where documents have been produced, books have been written about, in the North, a lot of impact benefit agreements and other relationship building things. And as Aaron was talking about, like what they're doing at colleges and universities, that there's a program, they're educating, like, some of that all might just be viewed as theory, but, there's real, like Heather says, there's real people behind it. And so us as Shared Path trying to be a resource to go find out some of those steps. And that through Shared Path, we were just approached with the official plan in Toronto, and we're talking to them about what can we do. And so they, after hearing me speak, they reached out. So we're talking, and that, and I said, if you're going to talk politics, you talk to the council. I'm not the council or the elected system. We're just trying to work through a process here. But like starting like real tangible work. In an example, in my speeches, I use Calgary as an example about where they set up a committee. They set up a direct relationship, and that has now evolved into that they're changing their official plan, and this is already a couple of years in the works, and making a bylaw. So now, during just last fall, our First Nation, Mississaugas of the Credit, and the relationship with the town of Caledon, they've taken the courageous step to include the First Nation in the official plan, and they're going to make a bylaw to go with it. The steps, it's going to be like the law. And so now we got an Ontario example about how do we get incorporated into, and then it's not final because I haven't seen the final yet, but it started to go through their process. And that's taken like years of, whether it's land claim protests that we've done down in the city, and to, deal with our issues and our promotions to go out there and say, we're the treaty people here, plus this is our traditional territory. And, I'm trying to make a movie, and I want to go down there and fish in those rivers and get caught and thrown in jail. And we'll figure out who's right in all of this. So we'll see how that happens in the future. getting too old to go stand in the river right now. But anyway, if the municipalities look at, if they're serious about that relationship, they look at what that might be. And the fact that this has happened, our First Nations isn't open to do it. And I hope that all the other First Nations are open to do it. I know a few that are really taking those kinds of steps, but it has to be as you say, it starts with people. It takes somebody to take one more step, ask one more question, and think that, push the system to do the right thing.
You wish, Carolyn. I want to apologize in advance. I'm going to try to get to everybody's questions, but that may not be possible. But I've got a good one here that, again, I'm going to answer first and then ask the panelists ideas on how to implement such an answer. So the question is, the hierarchy of planning currently privileges the Planning Act, the provincial policies, followed by municipal policies and zoning. That's the hierarchy of those planning policies. Should planners rethink this hierarchy? And what's the respective Indigenous laws and Treaty of the Land? How does that be incorporated into that? So my answer to that is that we do need to decolonize policy. We need to decolonize planning. So the question is going to be to the panelists: how do we decolonize policy that ensures that we are looking at the perspectives of Indigenous peoples, of our way of looking at the land, Indigenous traditional knowledge, making sure it's respectful of Indigenous laws and the treaties? How do we truly decolonize these frameworks for planning? So let's start with Aaron again, Heather, then Carolyn. So Aaron.
That's a big question, because there's it's the process itself is colonial. Like everything from the top to the bottom, it's a colonial process. It was created hundreds of years ago for the purpose of doing that. So I'd say it's a challenge for anybody who's like, say you're working for a municipality and you're a planner, or you're one cog in the whole machine, right? Or I think the important thing is just to start building those relationships, like Heather had mentioned, and start it's the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. So it's, whatever has happened in the past, whatever, bad relationship or lack of relationship you've had with First Nations communities, I'd say starting today, starting fresh is the best thing you can do. So just starting to, build those relationships now would be my advice.
You go, Sharon. Heather, how do we decolonize the planning framework?
Yeah, well, I'd like to come back to this idea about the planning hierarchy, with the Planning Act being considered foundational. And I think one of the things we can do is consider the treaties, consider the agreements that were made about how this land would be shared, consider, even pre-contact treaties or treaties are kind of diplomatic agreement made between Indigenous peoples about how lands and resources would be shared and how people would live well together. There are many agreements that were made between different Indigenous nations before the arrival of Europeans. And I think these, in addition to post-contact treaties, should be considered part of the fundamental framework that should be guiding how we organize our relations between people and the environment. They're part of the framework that gives Canada its legitimacy. And so if we're talking about decolonizing planning, and I think Aaron pointed this out before, colonization is about a process about land, right? It's about claiming land. It's about power over land. And I think if we're talking about decolonizing planning, we need to be talking about processes that are centered on land and the restoration of authority and decision-making over land and land use. And so a big part of that will be power and decision-making. And I think if we go back to those foundational agreements, if we go back to those treaties, we start to find new ways to think about authority and thinking about decision-making. And so that means it's not just changing planning hierarchies, it's really changing what we think of as planning and what we think of as the knowledge base of planning, and bringing Indigenous worldviews into those processes, right? And shaping new processes that see that knowledge as foundational.
Thanks, Heather. And you raise a really good point about the hierarchy, and that there's the treaties need to fit into that hierarchy. Indigenous law and those Supreme Court decisions that Carolyn talks about need to fit into that hierarchy. Because when we talk about the hierarchy of laws in Canada, the Constitution takes primacy over all laws, over all policy. That includes Section 35. Look that up, Section 35 of the Constitution, which it reinforces and justifies those Indigenous rights and treaty rights. So, Carolyn, you're going to get the last word on this question. So, how would you go about decolonizing planning? What is your approach to that?
Well, first, like the mindset. When, like I said, it has to start from the top. Say all the right words and everything, but does it devolve into the law? And that when the planner or the municipality has been trained, educated previously, and media promotes, like what's happening with the First Nations, that they that planner has to, and that council, I'll call it governing body, that they have to address who elected them, the taxpayer or the ratepayer. So they're looking for, that's if somebody calls it in the question there, the public good, that they're going to treat everybody well and everybody's going to get a good street and, water and sewer and all of that kind of stuff. And that, and they get to take it for granted. That's all just going to be given to them and nobody's going to get in their way. So it goes back to the part about capitalism, is that the whole taking of the land was set up for this. And like the people, so many people, when I go out and do my little Indian 101 talks, I tell them, I said, we were told a lie and we've been living it. And that you were told that you bought the land and that you pay your taxes and you get a deed and it's yours and you can do what you want with it in this framework. For us, we were told that the land, we were going to be set aside on these little blocks of land, Indian reserves, and that we were going to be looked after forever and we're not going to pay taxes. And so many don't understand how deep that scenario is, that we were not going to have to pay taxes to the system for it. And that's why they're like, why are we non-taxpayers? And me, the common person out here in Brantford, has to put $2 on the table to get everything I want, and you get it for free. And when you talk about those treaties, those arrangements, those relationships that were built in order to make that, the taking of the land, they think that doesn't apply anymore. So the education and awareness is important, and that the understanding, like the thing. So, and it's happening today. I was just talking to another friend who was a planner, and how the planners, say in the city of Toronto, are being permitted, allowed, and given approval to build a site, and they're going to take less and less open space away from the people in order that they can put more people in that condo and charge a higher price and then less and less. And they take the water. Like, it's just ongoing how these things are still happening. I mean, it's an issue. They should not accept that, yet they do. And that, they got no place to go walk and enjoy nature and stuff. That it's it's a convoluted, horrible system. And who says that a city of 5 million people is nice?
Yeah.
Look at what we got with, like they haven't built it for the health and wealth or the health and safety of the people. They built it for the wealth. Mm-hmm. And that economies of scale will make us wealthy. And the system has allowed that. And we're going too far down that path. And so with my fellow planner, we want to talk about that. Why are you taking away the land from the people? They pay for it. They're taxpayers, they pay. So I think that system really has to get shaken up a bit. And that these things that the MZOs are just go ahead, they're ignoring everybody, even their own taxpayers, and just for the sake of, a bigger, better building. So, no, I think it's got to go to the top, and, they got to understand what that treaty means and how it still impacts today, and who's going to come to the table to, to make you aware, to put things on the table, or, test the system.
No.
I think that's what we should do, test the system.
Miigwech, Carolyn, thank you so much. And how about a big round of applause for all of our panelists, Carolyn King, Dr. Heather Dorries, and Aaron St. Pierre. Miigwech, beautifully done. Thank you so much. And thank you for all your questions and attending today. And thank you for allowing me to be your moderator and your facilitator. I'm going to turn back to Morgan from Shared Path to close us off. Over to you, Morgan.
Great. Thank you so much, Bob. And thank you, Heather and Carolyn, Aaron and Bob, for sharing your thoughts, your insights, and your experiences. I also want to give a big shout out to David Stinson and Matt McLean, who helped us shape this webinar back in the fall. Just a quick reflection, what stood out to me from this conversation is that anti-Indigenous racism in planning often manifests itself by, as Heather and Aaron both said, ignoring the relationships that are embedded in the land, by ignoring the history of the land, and finding ways not to engage with Indigenous nations often through jurisdictional justifications, like Carolyn's early example. And it does take a long time for laws and policies to change. But in the meantime, I think we can all make a difference by prioritizing creating good relationships with Indigenous communities and educating ourselves. So I really want to thank all the participants, everyone, for being here today to listen and to learn from these excellent panelists. We couldn't get to all the questions, but Shared Path, we're trying to answer these types of questions and provide support for your learning. And some of the tools that we're working on are the Shared Land Map, which the Greenbelt Foundation is funding, and we hope to launch that by the end of this year. But we welcome your feedback, your questions, your suggestions, and if you're not a member yet of Shared Path, we welcome you to join, and you can do so by visiting our website, sharedpath.ca. And maybe I'll just, Carolyn, since you provided some words of opening, maybe you just want to say a few words of closing before we sign off.
Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity to talk about these issues. They're close to my heart, and thank you for all those that are participating. And that let's all work together on changing the world. And it takes one step on your part and on our part to start to work on those things. And together, maybe we can improve things for the better for all. Miigwech.
Miigwech, Carolyn, Miigwech, Morgan, and have a great day, everyone. Thank you so much. Good afternoon.